familiar with the concept of sovereignty. You know, we have sovereign nations, supposedly, and that is the narrow definition of sovereignty, which is you have a flag, you have a government, you have your territory, your army, your football team, your national anthem, and we think we have sovereignty and independence because foreign troops have left a long time ago. Although in many parts of the continent they haven't actually left to this day. But that's the narrow definition of sovereignty. What we focus on is really the concept of economic and monetary sovereignty. And before we can talk about what it is that we want to, decolonize, it's very important to understand what the colonial economic structure was designed to do. And then we'll understand that it's still actually doing what it was designed to do, that it never left. So you can summarize the economic role that was imposed on the African continent in three major points. Number one, we're supposed to be the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. We still play that function to this day. Number two, we're supposed to be the consumers of industrial output and technology from the industrialized world, not the producers, the consumers. And we still play that function to this day. And number three, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world, is outsourced to us under the label of development, cooperation, job creation, technical assistance. But effectively, what it does is that it permanently locks us at the bottom of the hierarchy, at the bottom of the global value chain. And we still play that role to this day. So these are the three major colonial roles that persist to this day. That's why we still insist on saying that our economies are still have colonial structures. And colonialism, just in case people forgot, is a system that was designed to produce violence, injustice, extractivism, hierarchies. It was not a system designed for development. It was not a system designed for democracy or justice or any of the good things that we want to achieve today. So why are we confused? Why are we, keeping a colonial system that was designed to produce all the bad results and then are surprised by our situation, saying, well, we don't have democracy, we don't have, development, we have, hierarchies and inequality. Well, the system is working perfectly the way it was designed. So what we need to do is change the engine of the system. So that's point number one. Point number two, which is very important observation for us to put on the table, is every policy advice that comes from the global north, every partnership proposal, every cooperation proposal that comes from the global north, we have to run it through a filter, run it through a system that says, is this policy proposal going to repeat those three functions or undo those three functions? And I guarantee you, once you start thinking in this way, you realize that there's nothing coming from the global north, whether it's on debt or development or climate or education or anything, that actually doesn't reproduce those structures. So that should be the filter that we as Africans, as people of the global south, our governments, our leaders should be using to assess our relationship with any assistance, even when people are coming to you with technical assistance and with money as grants, not even loans. Grants can also be part of the entrapment, right? So we have to wake up and realize that this is the filter that we should be using. And then we have to realize that our experts on the continent, myself included, right? People who went through the Western education system, the economics curriculum that we went through, we also went through a system that is deeply colonial in its thinking. So you can be African, you can be an expert, you can be, the number one supporter of Pan-Africanism and African liberation, and still be deeply rooted in neo-colonial thinking because of your education. So decolonizing the mind is a very serious thing. Of course, people are familiar with the book and with the concept, but it's easier said than done, right? So we have a lot of work to do so that we start assessing our own thinking about what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is not good. And I was able over time to kind of go back to these three major points. I say, okay, my thinking might be, neo-colonial. My education might be neo-colonial, but I need to know if this particular policy proposal is going to perpetuate these three economic functions or undo them. That's the simplest filter I can come up with. And then you think backwards and you try to realize, okay, so what is the alternative? And we can go through a whole bunch of false solutions and dangerous distractions that are being implemented today as, quote unquote, good solutions for development, for democratization, for decarbonization, for saving the planet. Most of them are actually designed for economic entrapment. And I'm often reminded of the famous phrase from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which is relevant in this case, in the context of the civil rights movement in the US, but it's relevant to our discussion here. When he said, I have no time for the tranquilizing drugs of gradualism, incrementalism, false solutions, dangerous distractions. I'm paraphrasing a little bit of his famous line here, but we need to be thinking in similar ways. There is no time for tranquilizing drugs, for false solutions, for gradualism. So that is the thing. And Martin Luther King, like many other thought leaders, he was a radical in not necessarily in the political sense of the term, although that might be true, but in the literal sense of the term. And all of us need to be radical in this sense, because in the literal sense, when you say radical, it means you go to the roots of the problem. And if you don't go to the roots, then you're operating at the surface level. And surface level intervention is designed to produce the status quo. So either radical solutions to undo the colonial role that was imposed on us. Otherwise, it's a superficial solution that's designed to produce the status quo, meaning the same colonial hierarchy, the same extractive, abusive, violent, non-democratic, unjust system. And we have to be very clear about it. If we're willing to accept that, then we just accept false solutions and celebrate false solutions and accept the colonial structures and then not complain about the injustice, about the underdevelopment, about all the bad things. But if we want to complain about the bad things, then we have to go to the roots of the problem and undo them one by one. So this is kind of in a way of opening the
Yeah.
discussion. And then I want to zoom in on particular aspects because people say, well, what are the practical solutions?
Yeah.
Where do we go with this? So a lot of people focus on the issue of debt. We say, well, we don't have money. We have to prioritize paying the debt. Well, you have to look at the source of external debt. And here we're talking about debt denominated in dollars and euros and British pounds. You look at the African continent, country by country, and you identify three major sources of that external debt, of the debt trap. Number one, it's the lack of food sovereignty. The fact that the continent today imports 85% of its food when we used to be the breadbasket for colonial powers less than a century ago. And that is not by accident, that is by design. And I'll explain very briefly what the design was. As soon as our country started to gain independence, there was actually a meeting in Europe, in Rome in 1955, one of the basic sort of pillars and foundations of the European Union, this meeting for the Treaty of Rome, where part of the discussion was, we have a problem in Europe, which is lack of food sovereignty. We're so dependent on the colonies. We need to change that. And that started a process that eventually led to the introduction of the Common Agricultural Policy, CAP for short, which is in place to this day, a basic pillar of the European Union, a system of heavy agricultural subsidies to support European farmers to produce wheat, corn, soybean, the core crops, barley, and so on. And it wasn't, of course, just Europe. It was the rest of the industrialized world, the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, and so on. All of these countries introduced heavy agricultural subsidies for core crops. And that forced our farmers out of business because they couldn't compete with the cheaper wheat and corn and barley coming from the subsidizing countries. So our farmers had to switch and specialize in what we call cash crops for exports. That's the coffee and tea and tobacco and all the other tropical fruits and all that, which on the surface of it is not a problem. But then you dig deeper and you realize
It's a
now you
problem.
have no food security. And the concept of food security was actually introduced during that time period in the 50s and 60s, because food security in the colloquial sense, when you and I speak about it, is kind of a, who doesn't like food security? But food security is a technical colonial term that was introduced, which means you secure the caloric nutrition of your people, either by producing it yourself, which we don't do anymore, or by buying it from abroad, which we do, or by borrowing money to buy it from abroad, which is how we get into a debt trap, or even worse, by receiving it as food aid. And you go back to the 50s and 60s and you remember the history of food aid interventions coming to save the starving people of the global south. Well, why are they starving? Because of the heavy agricultural subsidies that destroyed the livelihood of their farmers, right? So food aid was the last nail in the coffin of our food sovereignty. So that's how we are today. And of course, this has severe consequences, not just in terms of debt, but also in terms of ecological consequences, environmental consequences, because when we specialize in producing cash crops for exports, then you have to focus on and prioritize what your consumers in the global north want to eat. So you start using non-native crops that are not native to your soil. You start using crops that need more irrigation, more water, which you have to build the infrastructure for and the logistics for. You have to use crops that require fertilizers because they're not used to your environment, and pesticides so the crops can survive the journey all the way to a supermarket in Sweden or in Switzerland or whatever, all of which you have to import. And you do that for 30, 40, 50 years, you've just burnt the fertility of your soil. And now you have to double down on bringing more potent seeds and fertilizers and pesticides, all of which you have to import. Right? And then comes Bill Gates with his solution, right, with the GMOs and all of that. So that's just one of the major sources of external debt. And you can see how, it goes beyond debt, right? And now we have to undo all of this damage by investing in food sovereignty and agroecology, not just as a solution to the debt problem, but as an ecological solution, as a solution so we can cope with the impact of climate change. That's source number one. Source number two is energy sovereignty or energy deficits. And when I say energy deficits on the continent, I'm not talking about my country, Tunisia, which doesn't have a lot of fossil fuels or energy sources in the past. I'm talking about our number one oil exporter on the continent and our number two oil exporter on the continent. Our number three, the biggest exporters have energy deficits. Nigeria, up until just a few months ago when the Dangote refinery opened, up to that point, Nigeria imported 100% of its gasoline from international markets. Angola, our second exporter, imports to this day 80% of its fuel from international markets. Why? Because in the old energy system that we're trying to phase out, the fossil fuel system, we've always been the technology to look for oil, to drill for oil, and to refine oil. Denied access to the technology. The technology exists for more than 100 years now. We never have access, full control, full sovereignty over that technology, which is why, it took Nigeria, decades when it's, the Dangote refinery is 50 years too late, right? The $20 billion should have been invested in our biggest potential, which is renewables today. So that's the energy sovereignty part. And similarly, by the way, today we're also being denied access to the technology to manufacture the renewable energy infrastructure, which is our biggest potential on the continent. And as you know, we talked about food and energy. No country on this planet can function without food, without energy. And we're already deficient in those two areas. And number three, the kind of manufacturing base, the big industrial activity that countries are supposed to have, the kind of manufacturing base that we were allowed to have is the kind where you have to import the machines, you have to import the fuel to power the factories, you have to import the intermediate components to assemble with low-cost labor, and we even import the packaging. So we end up with a manufacturing base that exports low value-added content and imports high value-added content. So you can double, triple, quadruple your exports with free trade agreements and partnerships and all of that. You're still locked at the bottom of the value chain. So now take these three components together, food, energy, and manufacturing deficits, and you have a structural trade deficit year after year, decade after decade. And the simple explanation, the economics of it here for the audience to understand is that when a country has a trade deficit, its currency becomes weaker relative to the dollar and the euro. So imagine you're Kenya, The Kenyan shilling is now weaker relative to the dollar. And with the weaker Kenyan shilling, everything I need to import the next morning, food, fuel, medicine, medical equipment, anything, is going to be more expensive because I have a weak currency. So this is true for the entire continent. All of our imports, basic necessities, food, fuel, medicine, and so on, we import them at a higher cost. So we literally import inflation in the most sensitive areas of our livelihood, food, fuel, and medicine. So that immediately forces our governments to put themselves in a defensive position to protect the most vulnerable, to do their best. So what do? Immediate band-aid solution, you subsidize food, you subsidize fuel, you subsidize health services as much as you can. And of course, it's unsustainable to do this for decades. And then the second thing our governments do is ask the experts, the central bankers, right? The guys who manage the foreign currency reserves and the value of the currency and inflation. They say to them, do your best to strengthen our currency, to stabilize the exchange rate. What do? They do the band-aid solution, which is borrow more dollars to stabilize the exchange rate and get deeper and deeper into that debt trap. And that is the source of the debt. And it has very serious colonial links to what I described earlier in terms of the food and energy and the colonial role that was imposed on our economies to be limited to low value added manufacturing, obsolete assembly line manufacturing. So now, when you have a major debt problem, like most of our countries do, then it's the lenders who impose on you the conditionalities of how to use the money, how to prioritize your budget. And of course, what they impose is, don't you dare invest in food sovereignty. Don't you dare invest in health and education. You have to prioritize investing in economic activity that will quickly generate dollars to pay us back. So that means you prioritize all the extractive policies, and you prioritize getting locked at the bottom of the value chain to assemble stuff for them, because that's what foreign investors do. They want cheap, low cost labor, low cost materials to be assembled for their economy, not for your economy. And even when they invest in your energy system, is to invest so that they can consume in the global north. Most of Nigeria's oil is not consumed there. And today, in the new energy system of green hydrogen and solar and green electricity, same thing. Investors are investing in order to extract green hydrogen, to extract solar, and so on. So if we're going to succeed in decolonizing, we have to invest in food sovereignty, not food security. We have to invest in renewable energy sovereignty, which is our biggest potential. And I'll give you just one number, because I know some people say, well, we have a lot of oil, we have a lot of gas. No, we don't. We have thousands of times more renewable energy potential than the obsolete energy system of the past. According to IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, 2 years ago, their report on Africa, you can summarize it in one number. They said by 2040, the African continent can produce 1,000 times its anticipated energy needs from renewables and completely replace all the fossil fuel exports. 1,000 times. Now, why are we not doing this? Why are we not attracting the financing and the manufacturing of renewable energy infrastructure? We attract less than 2% of financing that goes towards renewables. And there's a very clear reason for this. Because if you actually unleash Africa's renewable energy potential the way it should be, then it's as if you've taken the power of OPEC, the oil exporting countries, which, these countries have, a significant weight in the energy system globally, a significant geopolitical weight, economic weight. Take that weight, multiply it by 1,000. That's Africa's potential. Now we see it as an opportunity, right? But people outside the continent, the adversaries of the continent, let's call them, they see it as a threat. They see it as a risk to be managed, to be eliminated, which is why we don't get access to technology to unleash that potential or financing to unleash that potential. And number 3, we need to invest in Pan-African industrial policies, not to assemble stuff for other people, but to build the building blocks of development and prosperity on the continent, starting with the things that we actually need. What we need is unleash our potential in the energy system, so manufacture and deploy renewable energy infrastructure, not for exports, but to deliver to the millions of people who have no access to electricity today as we speak. Number two, to manufacture and deploy clean cooking infrastructure for the 950 million people on the continent today who are inhaling toxic fumes on a daily basis because of lack of clean cooking infrastructure, mostly women and children. And number three, to manufacture and deploy the clean transportation infrastructure to build the logistics of development and prosperity, to connect our cities, our economies on the continent, so that our logistical infrastructure is not built outwards towards the ports to export. We want the continent to build the inwards logistics of infrastructure and development. And I insist on this being Pan-African industrial policies, not national industrial policies, not because Pan-Africanism is just a nice thing we say to each other in these meetings and we celebrate Pan-Africanism. I say it because Pan-Africanism and South-South unity and solidarity is actually an economic and geopolitical necessity. It's not just a nice thing to have. Without it, we will not have anything. And there's a very simple economic reason for it, because industrialization requires what economists call economies of scale. Economies of scale is a very simple concept without which you can't industrialize. Let's say I want to manufacture this pen. If I manufacture only 1,000 units per year, it's like doing it by hand, essentially. Very few units. So the cost per pen will be very expensive. But if I manufacture 10 million units per month, right, because I have access to a large market like the continent, then the cost per unit will become cheaper. The quality will improve. The efficiency will kick in. And then innovation and research and development will kick in immediately. So our economies are too small to industrialize. Because if you try to industrialize by yourself, you end up manufacturing a small component in somebody else's industrial policy, which is what we do today. But the advantage that we have is that we're a continent of 1.2, 1.3 billion people. We're the size of India and China, right? Except potentially richer because we have all the resources and we have the youngest labor force on the planet. We have the complementarity of resources and capabilities across the continent. So that is the opportunity, which again, every time I say it's the opportunity, you have to remember that it's perceived as a threat, as a risk to be managed, to be eliminated. So that's why I insist on Pan-African industrial policies. And that's why you go back and you realize that's why we've always been denied access to the financing, but especially the technology to unleash that potential. So first, we have to do our homework as Africans to co-design these strategies, to understand that without these strategies, we will not move forward. Without these strategies and without unity, we will not move forward. And then strategize and come up with a geopolitical leverage that will force the other economic blocs that actually have access to the technology to actually share it with us, to do real partnership rather than neo-colonial extraction. And I can talk a little bit, in the discussion about what that geopolitical leverage should be and what is the opportunity that we have today. But I'll open it up for discussion so we can have more time to unpack.
Okay. Bro, thanks for that powerful start, because it basically unpacks everything I've been thinking and more. So my first question to you, I've got quite a few questions all over the place on my phone and my notebook. So I've got questions from people who I've got people on this question on the screen as well. But my first question to you is, saying what you said and knowing what we know now, why? And I personally know what your answer is going to be, but why are African leaders not doing the needful to make this work for us? Why are they being the weaker link for African countries?
Mm-hmm. Very good question. So the way I think about it, I imagine, our adversaries in the global north, let's call them, some presidents and prime ministers who don't want to see this potential unleashed, kind of sitting in their office and they have like a dashboard for each one of our countries, dashboard of vulnerabilities, pressure points,